everyone. Welcome to day one of Rare Evo. We have an absolutely fantastic panel ahead on open source, Web3 meets enterprise. By way of world's briefest introduction, my name is Raquel Buscaino, and I lead Deloitte's Novel and Exponential Technologies team, or our NEXT team, where we sense and make sense of emerging tech. We have an astounding panel. We have Sophia Lopez, who is the founder and COO of Kaleido, and we have Daniela Barbosa, who is the executive director of the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. So we got 25 minutes. That is no time at all to discuss a topic as deep as this, but maybe we'll just kick off. Daniela, maybe you can introduce yourself, the projects you represent, and then Sophia, you can do the same as well.
Sure. So, I'll start off. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. This is my third Rare Evo, and it's always such a great audience and great discussions that we have. So I'm really looking forward to the next 2 days with all of you as well. My name is Daniela Barbosa, as Raquel said. I am the general manager for decentralized technologies at the Linux Foundation, and I also serve as executive director of the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. For those of you who don't know what the Linux Foundation is, for the last 30 years, we've been the home for, I would say, the most important open source projects. Anything that you touch today from a technology perspective probably has a piece of open source, most definitely has a piece of open source that has a home at the Linux Foundation, obviously the Linux kernel from an operating system. For the last 10 years, we're actually celebrating our 10th year anniversary this year. We've had decentralized technology projects, including blockchain, digital identity projects that have really powered a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, and a lot of the things that many of the vendors and the users and the builders here at Rare Evo use. So I'm very excited for the discussion today.
Amazing, thank you. Sophia?
Thanks, Raquel. And always, I spend a lot of time with Daniela, so it's always great to see you at these events. So yeah, reflecting, actually, it's been, in my background, I'm president and a founder of Kaleido, which is year 8, with bringing Web3 technologies to real companies, real enterprise, helping drive adoption. Open source is a big part of that story. For me, it's year 10 of enterprise blockchain. I actually was at IBM for a decade, and my last job at IBM was helping start the IBM blockchain platform business unit, which was a managed service. We ran first ones to run blockchain as a managed service. We actually contributed our open blockchain code to what became the Hyperledger Foundation, which now is part of the broader umbrella of Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. So very strong conviction around doing things in the open. Blockchain's a team sport. We need to do this as a community. And actually, in terms of the 10-year mark, a lot of fun celebrations. I was at the NASDAQ last week ringing the bell for Ethereum's 10-year mark with the Ethereum community. So Kaleido provides flexibility and choice. So we run all the popular enterprise-grade open source technologies that enterprise want to use. Obviously, Ethereum is one, and there's many others under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation.
Amazing. Well, so before we dive into, I think, a lot of the details we're going to get into, maybe we can level set and talk about what open source really means in the context of Web3, because I think it's a little bit more than just having code on GitHub. So maybe you can start off, Daniela, and share what does open source mean to you and why is it so important?
So there's no doubt that open source has won the game when it comes to blockchain and decentralized technologies, right? Everybody knows that if you can't see the code, you shouldn't trust the code as well. So we always encourage, and we love companies and ecosystems who publish their code so that everybody could take a look at it. Open source that is openly developed and openly governed is really critical for decentralized technologies and networks that ultimately are, building financial infrastructure, that are building these long-term infrastructure systems. And so let me explain the difference in that. Everyone, and we highly encourage this, to have an open source license. Choose your license of choice. We really believe the Apache 2.0 license is the best suited for enterprise use cases. But you open source your code, and you make sure that people can see the code and see what's going on. But how do you build on-ramps for people to actually be able to contribute to that code? right? How do people understand the governance? How are decisions made around the code that the developers and the maintainers are contributing to? And that's a big difference, because very often an open source code, you can see it in GitHub, but how do you make an influence? Like, if you want to use the code, you show up and you submit an issue, for example, or a PR, and you say, I want to make this enhancement, or I want to fix this bug. Making sure that you have very clear path for people to do that is critical. And this is what the Linux Foundation for the last 30 years has done, is build these communities of developers and users who understand how that code project, and standards too, standards and specifications, how those projects are maintained, what are the roadmaps for the projects, and it's very clearly defined the governance model. You'll find many people here today, obviously the Cardano ecosystem does a fantastic job with open governance as well. Across the board, when you're looking at a project and you want to understand, is this truly openly developed, right, and openly governed, it's a critical decision point to using the code and then building all the applications on it, because that's the core of what you do. When we work with hundreds and thousands of companies around the world. We work with governments, and what we hear over and over again is that when they make a decision on a protocol or they make a decision on a specific code base, making sure that it's openly developed and openly governed is critical to them, because they know that it is always going to be vendor neutral. They're always going to have many companies and organizations contributing to that, because that neutrality drives the development in the code process. So open source that is openly developed and openly governed is really the key to building true decentralized systems.
Sophia, I'm going to assume that that's the same thing that you found from your work as well. Maybe we can take a spin at what are the challenges that enterprises are facing today when it comes to adopting Web3 technologies? Because I think Daniela just mentioned, uncertainty around open source, or we're talking about governance. Like, what are the considerations that enterprises really have at top of mind as they seek to adopt?
Sure. I think I'll just bridge on a bit of what Daniela was saying, and some special considerations in the blockchain space. So you're looking at, decentralized networks, multi-party networks, and then I'll get to the broader question as well. So one thing you find, if it's one company using open source themselves, you might have an open source program office and you have certain considerations, and Daniela's walking through some of them. When you have a multi-party network, we've worked, for example, with a number of central banks and commercial banks on a unified ledger project where, they want to get more adoption. They want more people to join. And then they asked us, really, what are some considerations on the open source side? Well, first of all, people don't want vendor lock-in. So if you look at, a situation in Web3, sometimes someone might say, hey, we just put the code into a GitHub repo, but we're the ones you need to come to, and you have to work with us no matter what. There's no community. So that feels like a vendor lock-in situation. If someone's saying, I'm making a decision for my next gen system which needs to work for decades, that introduces risk. But then if you're joining a multi-party network and maybe you have competitors in there trying to work together as an industry, you don't want to feel there's backdoors in this code base. And even if potentially it might be loosely open sourced, if you can't see the commits, you can't see the chain of trust when you get a new release, what's been changed, who did that? Could you even weigh in on some of those changes? Even if you say, I don't have the skills to add to this code base, and I'm not, my developers aren't going to be contributing, but I do want to see what's happening and have that chain of trust, because every commit is hash and it's immutable, and you have that confidence to join, and this helps with some of these projects to be able to really scale and get to adoption. So I think this leads to your question, what are inhibitors for enterprises with Web3? If they want to move into production, how, if it's a multi-party network, how do you really scale from that initial, maybe they started with the POC, then they went to, half dozen people in a pilot with real data, and they get that early production then they want to go to like mainstream and then mass scale production, and you really get the big dogs of the ecosystem and the long tail. Now you're thinking about performance and transactions per second, which our team has done a lot. We're the maintainer for Besu code base, which is in the Linux Foundation, and how do you get to many tens of thousands of TPS if you're a payment processor, and this is what your systems need to do, day to day. So helping clients with that. And then, of course, there's considerations around, security, compliance, data governance, like the architecture needs to be such that you can keep the data residency in the country and it's not going to leave the borders. And then one big topic, that really emerges as people move to production is privacy. So I know I was on a panel in Singapore where there were like two completely public DeFi people. They were like, you can't have anonymity. And regulators hate that. I'm like, no, in enterprise, you have to have confidentiality, anonymity, data masking, history masking, because you don't want to see, who's transferring what and what the quantities are, and you don't want anyone to go to the ledger and reverse engineer that. So there's been really a great explosion, I think, of like focus on this in recent years. I think there was a number of years of cryptographers in the industry were just looking at L2s and scaling, but now there's been a lot of focus really shifting to the core privacy requirements, and there's some very exciting projects. One of them is called Paladin, that's in the Linux Foundation, and that's been used by a number of the leading central banks and global transaction banks in a variety of projects, and there's a lot of innovation in a lot of different sectors. People have different use cases, different requirements, so it's important to sort of understand the trade-offs and pros and cons of each.
So you mentioned privacy there quite a bit. I think interoperability, and not just between systems, but between actual projects, is also a big consideration here. Daniela, maybe you can speak to some of those projects that you've specifically worked on.
Yeah, and I'll explain one thing, because very often, and especially in Web3 conferences like this, the concept of a foundation is very different than what the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust Foundation does. So one of the things that I think is critical, because it kind of helps bridge what Sophia was talking about, is we really do three things. One is we make those developers and maintainers successful and happy. And if you have successful and happy developers, you have great code bases as well. Make sure that they have the right tooling, make sure that they have the right resources. If you go and visit us at the LF Decentralized Trust booth today, you'll meet some of our community architects that support these communities as well. So making sure that they understand project life cycles, what is really enterprise-grade open source development. That is core. Number two is training and certification, especially when you're talking about code that is going to be used in enterprises, in governments, in really, infrastructure projects. You have to have developers that are trained. And if you look at how many developers in the Web3 world versus developers in the Web2 world, the Linux Foundation has the access to millions and millions of developers who've been developing in Web3 technologies for a long time. We've trained and certified millions of developers in these technologies. Bringing that into the Web3 space is really critical. And number three, to Sophia's point, is really building a very healthy and commercial ecosystem of companies that can help support these projects. For the last 10 years, and you'll find in the biggest banks, you have some fantastic engineers, people that are contributing to our projects. We just did a developer showcase with a developer from Citi on their contributions. So you have engineers that know it. But to really scale these technologies, to put them into production implementation that has SOC compliance and risk compliance, you need vendors in a commercial ecosystem that really, really supports it. So that's the three things that the foundation does. And how do we do this? We take all our projects. So today we have 17 different open source projects under LF Decentralized Trust. Those projects co-collaborate with each other all the time. So Sophia mentioned Paladin, which is in our labs right now. And Paladin supports Besu and will support other ledgers as well. So how do we get the community to come together to do that? Yesterday we made a very exciting announcement here at Rare Evo that Shielded Technologies has joined as a premier member to help support. We are a member organization. But more importantly, they've also have submitted, and if you go in our technical advisory council Github, you can see the proposal for the Midnight Compact smart contract language to become an open source project under the foundation. What does that mean? Back to your point about collaboration and cross of these projects, is privacy now is not just one project or one community working on it. We're actually going to be working across the Midnight community, across the Ethereum community, across other ecosystems to really understand the needs and the requirements of privacy. So a foundation really brings kind of those working pieces together, and sometimes they argue, sometimes they disagree, and very often they actually have two different code bases that might do two different things, but the core principles of open source and open development is there. So an implementer makes a decision on what they want to implement, but they understand that it's been collaboratively done in the open. So that's a really important piece. And privacy is obviously so important to be able to have the principles of privacy-first implementations working together, right? Because you can't be private in one way on one chain and then have privacy attached in a different way, because it won't work.
Healthy competition. I like healthy competition.
Good, put the mic
Healthy competition is what I like. Thank you. Question for you, Sophia, is we just talked about privacy a little bit more. What do you think enterprises struggle with most when it comes to this? And I would say, where do you see the future of privacy evolving in the next 5 years, if we call it? If we're having this conversation in 5 years, what do you hope we've accomplished by then and is table stakes?
Yeah, I think where enterprises have struggled is that a lot of times solutions are just partially solving the problem. There's a lot of excitement, for example, around zero-knowledge proofs. That's just like one component, it's one piece, and enterprises need the full stack solution. So Daniela mentioned Paladin, and we also briefly touched upon, I guess, interoperability between the different Linux Foundation projects. So Paladin is a framework, can work with any EVM ledger, so that helps enterprises because it's an unmodified EVM. It can work with layer 2s. A lot of the layer 2s need privacy as well. And then there's even non-EVM code bases that there are parts of the framework from Paladin that could help, like Canton, for example. But basically, an enterprise might need in one transaction, let's say there's a CSD someone who's issuing, a trusted entity issuing a bond. So they might have a certain style of privacy, but they're notarizing this bond, they're issuing it. So that's a certain type of token. Then there's other actors they want to use a zero-knowledge proof back token in this transaction. Then you might have a stable coin or just ERC20. And then there might be certain workflow or rules that you need in a privacy group just to keep the off-chain parts private as well. And all of those token types need to work together to settle one atomic transaction. So, really, if you look at what the struggle is that enterprises will look at a piece of the puzzle, but they need the whole thing to work together to execute one transaction atomically. And then any unmodified blockchain ledger, so it's not like a unicorn. You don't need to create a whole dedicated new system you need to onboard. It could just work with global uniqueness. The tokens are common token standard types. So that's really what in the last year Paladin has been solving. But again, this is year 5 or 6. Kaleido's been around for 8 years. We start working in privacy 6 years ago. So in the different corners of those what's now all into framework, and it's very pluggable. The framework, you can bring in different zero-knowledge proof implementations. There's one there now that's called Zito, that's quantum safe. Berkeley just proved that out. But a lot of the big banks or other players in the space, they have zero-knowledge proof implementations. They want to plug that in. You could work with the fully homomorphic instantiations and others. So we're looking in the next decade of permanent systems are going to production. You need to have that flexibility and choice to expand and to continue pulling in sort of the best technologies that are emerging and best techniques without having to rewrite everything you've done. I guess this is like the IBM background. Everything needs to be backward compatible. But because when you have a breaking change, people might have invested quite significant sums of money to get the system up. They don't want to have to tear it down and rebuild from scratch again.
Daniela, I'd actually like to ask you the same question, which is if we're having this conversation in 5 to 10 years, what do you hope is table stakes by then, and maybe even where do you see the future heading in that regard?
Yeah, I'll build on one of the things that Sophia has said about modularity, because I think it has been a very important piece of across all our projects of decentralized trust is how do you create tools that are modular, meaning people can plug in the things, whether it's a consensus or something else, people can plug in the things that work for them, because there is not one solution to solve them all. And we say there's not one blockchain to solve them all. We've said that it is going to be a multi-blockchain ecosystem, for example. It's going to continue to be so. So there's these things that when you start thinking about the plumbing, right, the non-sexy plumbing stuff at the bottom, making sure that as you build, and as you build for today and today's needs and the long-term needs, whether it's making sure that it meets the criteria to be able to build upon it as well. So I think we're going to continue seeing the code projects, the implementations, and the companies really pushing the boundaries of some of these technologies and then finding the innovation to push it further as well. So, and I think when you think about that today, in 2017 when I joined the Linux Foundation, people were already asking me hey, when is blockchain going to be a thing? And I would say 10 to 20 years, and people are like, oh my God, no, it's going to be much quicker. Well, we're 10 years in here, but there's still a lot of things that need to be really pushed further. Take decentralized identity, for example. We haven't had the opportunity to talk about that today. This is really an important piece of the puzzle that we're all going to have to work together on, right? Because our identity as individuals, the identity of companies, for example, and more so, over the last 6-12 months, the concept of agentic AI, the identity of an agentic bot basically working for you around different ecosystems. Identity is going to be critical to that. So I think one of the things, and maybe next year when we come in to do a panel, we focus on what are the key things from a decentralized identity perspective that all the applications at the plumbing and at the application layer need to take advantage of.
I do think it's going to be critical with agentic AI moving forward. I think that is going to be a hot conversation if you haven't, if there's no panels on it this weekend.
I did want to add one more thought to your question previously, Raquel. I think another area for enterprises, and it's important to touch upon with this community here, being able to interoperate between different code bases. You think you might have assets on different chains, different communities. You want to be able to access, liquidity and be able to access different customers with those assets under management. So one project called Firefly, and there's a workshop on Firefly tomorrow, as well as one on Paladin. One I think is at 11 and the other's at 1 o'clock. But you can come to our booth and learn more. But Firefly has a whole series of connectors to other communities. And Cardano community has been working on their, building a connector to Firefly, and have just launched that. So feel free to come by the booth and learn more about that. So you can really have that brain that looks at all of your Web3 digital assets as they move across different chains and communities. And that's an important requirement just to scale and go to production, because there's not going to be, enterprises know they'll need to access different, liquidity pools, different clients are going to be working with different ecosystems. So they need to be able to interconnect between all of those, interoperate.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. How many people were here for Charles's keynote this morning? Welcome keynote. So, he talked about multiple ecosystems, and I think Cardano and Midnight and Ethereum and Hedera. We actually have Hyro, which is the code base for Hedera. There's also a workshop tomorrow on that. It is fantastic to see everybody in the room, all with the same purpose of making sure that these projects succeed and move forward, but also collaborate to, once again, to get those core things, whether it's identity, whether it's privacy, whether it's, interoperability correct for the ecosystem as well. So it's just been fantastic discussions so far.
Amazing. Well, Daniela, Sophia, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I highly encourage you to join the workshops if you haven't considered it yet. You can learn more at their booths. And please join me in thanking them for their time.
Thank you, Raquel.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoying Rare Evo? Then lock in your spot for next year right now. Rare Evo 2026 is already in the works, and it's going to be even bigger. More chains, more builders, more connections. Tickets are live. Go to rareevo.io/2026 to grab your early access pricing before it's gone. Don't wait. Be first. Be part of what's next. We'll see you at Rare Evo 2026.